Have you ever felt like you were skipping over an important part of the Bible, like there was something hidden in plain sight? Well, many people skip right over First Chronicles, as if it were just a boring list of names and numbers. But what few realize is that this book is like the backbone of Israel's spiritual identity. It connects genealogies, ancient promises, battles, and key moment of worship all with a greater purpose to remind the people who they are and who their God is. So, stay with me until the end because I will show you how this forgotten book can transform your understanding of faith, leadership, and the divine purpose for the chosen people. And don't forget to take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell because you won't find powerful content like this anywhere else. Just imagine the people had just returned from exile in Babylon. They were lost, discouraged, and their self-esteem was in ruins. The biblical chronicler, inspired by God, writes as if to say, hey, you are not just any people. You are a royal offspring, a chosen nation, heirs of eternal promises. It is more than his story. It is the restoration of identity. It is the chosen people being reminded of where they came from and where they're going. The book of Chronicles is like that older relative who tells stories around the table, not just entertain, but to teach, correct, and awaken memories. In it, we see that God has forgotten no name, no tribe, no promise. David is not just a king. He is a symbol of the covenant, of the leadership that unites tribes, leads the army of Israel, and brings the Ark of the Covenant back to the center of worship. All of this points to something much greater, the messianic promises that echo to this day. If you've always thought this book was just a rehash of Samuel or Kings, get ready for a whole new perspective. There's gold hidden here, not literal, of course, but spiritual. And best of all, it all has everything to do with your faith today. Because understanding what God did with Israel in the past completely changes the way we live in the present. Are you ready to dive into one of the Bible's most overlooked treasures? And the most surprising thing? By understanding First Chronicles, you better understand the entire Old Testament and even Jesus' purpose. Yes, it's all connected, and you're about to find out why. From the first verses, the first book of Chronicles already shows us that it is not just a record of battles or a copy of previous books. Its purpose is much deeper, to reconstruct the spiritual identity of Israel after the trauma of exile. Imagine the people who have lost everything: land, temple, honor. How can they recover their dignity? The chronicler offers the answer by remembering the God's promises, a tradition of Israel and the call to fidelity and holiness. This book is like a mirror that invites the nation to look back, to recognize who has always been at the center of everything, the God of Israel, and find the strength to start over. The context in which this book was written is crucial. The Jews had returned from Babylon with a broken heart, without a temple, without a throne, without stability. It was like trying to rebuild a house without remembering the original design. And that is precisely what the chronicler does. He rearranges the pieces, points out the promises that still remain, and places God at the center of the nation again. More than a memory of the past, Chronicles is a guide to the future. It is as if to say, we are not here by chance. We are the chosen people, and we have a history that sustains us. Unlike other records, here there is no focus on the mistakes of the kings or the failings of Israel. The tone is more pastoral, more healing. The chronicler does not hide the sins, but chooses to highlight the God's faithfulness above all. He narrates with purpose not to judge, but to restore. He invites us to delve into the messianic promises, already David's leadership, in the everlasting covenant made with Zion, now elevated a spiritual capital of the nation. Each line was written to rekindle hope, rebuild faith, and remind us that God still walks with his people. This book is an invitation to see history from a new perspective, not just as isolated events, but as a divine plan that connects names, events, and generations. Each genealogy, each mention, carries a profound spiritual value. And contrary to what many people think, the book is not boring. It is rich, symbolic, and full of revelations. When we read it carefully, we realize how much it paves the way to the Messiah and reclaims Israel's central role as a light to the nations. If you feel like your faith needs some grounding, that you lack clarity about your identity in God, diving into this book may be just what you need. Because, like Israel, we all need to remember where we came from, where we're going, and who's driving the story. And that's just the beginning. In the next section, we'll discover why there are so many genealogies in the first place and what they have to do with you today. When opening the first 9 chapters of First Chronicles, many readers may be tempted to skip right past. It is a long list of names, tribes, and descendants. But what seems like just a bureaucratic record is, in fact, a spiritual map that connects the people of Israel to their divine identity. These genealogies are much more than historical data. They are statements of belonging, memories that connect each individual to the promise made by God to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and David. Each name carries a testimony. You are part of the covenant. The chronicler begins with Adam, passes through Noah, and reaches the tribes of Israel, showing that God's plan is transgenerational, which did not begin in exile nor end there. By organizing these records, he reaffirms that even after the captivity, the royal, priestly, and Levitical lineage still exists. In other words, the people may have been uprooted from the land, but they were not uprooted from the heart of God. The promises remain alive. The genealogies are like deep roots in sacred soil, a way of saying, you're not a spiritual orphan. You belong. Another powerful point is in the names that appear unexpectedly. There are figures that reappear and others that gain prominence, even though they are rarely mentioned in other books. This shows that God values each lineage, even those that seem minor to human eyes. Furthermore, this genealogical organization also revives the role of the Levites, the temple musicians, the priests, and the gatekeepers of the Lord, house roles that have been forgotten in exile but are now remembered with honor. It is as if God were saying, return to your posts. I am still counting on you. These genealogies are like invisible pillars that support the temple of Israel's spiritual identity. They teach us that there is nothing irrelevant in history when God is the author. And, spiritually speaking, they also challenge us to reflect, what is our root? Are we connected to the promise? Are we aware that we belong to something greater? In the next topic, we will see how this foundation connects with the emergence of David as the great turning point in the chronicler's narrative. The scene is tragic and symbolic. Mount Gilboa becomes a scene of one of the most painful falls in the biblical history of Israel. Saul, the first anointed king, is defeated by the Philistines. The army scatters, his sons fall in battle, and he, gravely wounded, decides to take his own life. It is a moment charged with tension and meaning. This is not just a military defeat, it is a bitter end of a reign that began with promises but ended in disobedience. The chronicler does not dwell on the gory details, but makes it clear Saul died because he was not faithful to the God of Israel. The Philistines, upon finding his body, do the unthinkable. They publicly dishonor him. They cut off his head, display his remains in pagan temples, and use his death as propaganda for their victory. This is an affront not only to Saul, but to the chosen people themselves. However, a glimmer of honor appears. Of valiant men of Jabesh Gilead cross into enemy territory, rescue the bodies of Saul and his sons, and bury them with dignity. Their faithfulness contrasts sharply with the king's decline. It is as if history were crying out, even when a leader fails, there are still men who remain faithful. The chronicler makes a point of explaining the spiritual reasons behind this tragedy. Saul died because he consulted a medium, disobeyed the Lord's orders, and did not trust God fully. This final comment is not a cold criticism, but a profound warning. It is a reminder that spiritual leadership demands holiness and reverence. The people needed to understand that Saul's failure was not just political. It was a symptom of something more serious, the abandonment of obedience to the God of Israel. Without God at the center of the nation, there is no throne that can be sustained. But there is something interesting here. The chronicler does not stop at dramatizing Saul's end for historical vanity. He wants to set the stage for something new. The tragedy of Gilboa paves the way for the anointing of David, king with a heart turned to the Lord. It is as if, by removing the figure of Saul, God is making room for the true promise blossomed. The people needed to see the difference between a reign without divine direction and one centered on faithfulness to God. And this contrast will become increasingly evident in the following chapters. Mount Gilboa will not be remembered simply as a place of defeat, but as a turning point in the biblical history of Israel. From the ashes of failure will arise the seed of a leadership that will change everything. David approaches, and with him, the restoration of the covenant, the conquest of the stronghold of Zion, and a return of the Ark of the Covenant to the center of worship. The narrative lives on and hope is renewed. Let's move on to the next chapter of this journey. The moment for which the entire narrative had been preparing arrived. David is finally anointed as king of Israel. But what is most surprising is who proclaims it. All the people, yes. Even the elders of Israel who had previously hesitated now gather in Hebron to declare, "Here are your bones and your flesh." This was not just a political recognition. It was a spiritual covenant. They remembered how David had already led the armies even under the reign of Saul. Now, with Saul out of the picture, the path is clear. David is God's chosen one, and the people's chosen one. Soon after his anointing, David takes a symbolic and strategic action. He sets out to conquer Jerusalem, the stronghold of the Jebusites. That city was not just a geographical point. It was the beating heart of Canaan, not yet dominated. The Jebusites mocked him, saying that even the blind and lame could stop him. But David, with boldness and faith, took the city and made it the capital of the kingdom. Jerusalem became the city of David, a spiritual, political, and prophetic center. It was as if God were saying, now begins a new era, with a new capital and a new vision. The Chronicle also highlights the mighty men of David, men with supernatural courage, capable of incredible feats. One of them, Joab, stands out by being the first to climb the water crossing to take the fortress. Others perform feats worthy of legend. But the most important thing is the tone in which the chronicler presents them. They are men who followed David because they recognize a move of God in his life. They were not just warriors, they were instruments of divine purpose, that each of them represents a piece of the building block of the kingdom after God's own heart, with David on the throne and Jerusalem under his rule. Something new blossoms in Israel. It is not just a new king, it is a birth, an era. The conquered city will become the center of worship of the Lord, the place where the ark will be placed, and where later the temple will be built. The chronicler wants the reader to understand with David begins a true theocratic reign. With a throne and the altar walk side by side, history is not just moving forward, it is being elevated to a new level. Even before David was crowned, many brave warriors had already sought him out in secret. They came from many tribes, risking everything to ally themselves with him while he was still being pursued by Saul. The text shows us a powerful truth. Loyalty to a divine purpose attracts people with the same heart and the same courage. These men discerned that God's anointing was upon David. Even when the world did not yet recognize, they were not following the throne, they were following a promise. Among them were the Benjaminite, Saul's own tribe, and the Gadites, who crossed the Jordan in time of flood, displaying remarkable bravery. Some were experts with bows, spears, swords, and shields, so others were natural leaders, like Amasai, who boldly declared, "We are yours. O David, we are with you, son of Jesse. Peace, peace to you." It was not just a battle cry. It was a spiritual covenant based on faithfulness, vision, and hope. But the most striking verse is the one that sums up the entire chapter. Day after day, they came to help David until he had formed a great army, like the army of God. This is a breathtaking expression. The chronicler is saying that this was not a human movement, it was something heavenly. David's army was more than soldiers, it was a people raised up by God to establish his kingdom on earth. When purposeful people come together for a divine cause, heaven manifests. That David's mighty men were not perfect, but they were willing. They represent those in every generation who choose to fight for what is right, even when the system is still against them. And for that, the chronicler honors them not just for their abilities, but for their hearts. They discern God's timing and will to end. That made them giants of faith. That David was at the height of his leadership. That Jerusalem had already been established as a capital, and now he wanted something to gird over, place the God of Israel at the center of the nation. His plan was to bring back the Ark of the Covenant, that sacred symbol of the divine presence that had been forgotten since the days of Saul before David. Worship was a priority, but even with good intentions, he went astray. And this teaches us something profound. It is not enough. To do the right thing, you have to do it the right way. The people celebrated enthusiastically. There was music, instruments, dancing. Everything seemed perfect. But David ordered the ark to be placed on a new ox cart as the Philistines did. And therein lies the problem. God had given clear instructions. The ark was to be carried by the Levites on their shoulders as a sign of reverence. Result, when the oxen stumbled, Uzzah reached out his hand to hold the ark and died instantly. That the repercussion was so great that David stopped everything. He was afraid. and perhaps even disappointed. But the mistake became a lesson. David sought to understand what had happened. And when he decided to try again, he did everything as God had commanded. He called the priests, sanctified the Levites, organized the shifts, and this time the ark was carried with holiness. The chronicler highlights this in great detail because the restoration of true worship comes through obedience. Worshiping God is not just a feeling, it is an act of reverence that requires understanding and surrender. And when the ark finally arrived in Jerusalem, the celebration was even greater at hymns, offerings, dancing, sacrifices, and a powerful psalm by David filled the city. He himself donned a priestly robe and led the procession. Jerusalem was no longer just a capital city, it was now the spiritual center of Israel. Identity of the chosen people was being restored around the presence of God. And this was only possible because David learned from his mistake and chose to obey it. In this chapter, God makes a promise that changes the history of Israel forever through the prophet Nathan. The Lord declares that David would not only be king of Israel, but that his house and kingdom will be established forever. This divine covenant is not just for that moment, but has eternal implications. It speaks directly of the Messiah who would come from David's line, that in other words, Israel's spiritual identity and its messianic promises are deeply rooted in David's leadership. The chronicler highlights that this promise does not depend on military force or politics, but on God's faithfulness to his chosen people. It is a clear demonstration that earthly power must be centered in God to be valid. This is a vital lesson for us today. Leadership without God at the center is doomed to failure. David was a king who understood this, even with his flaws, and for this he received eternal blessing. Now furthermore, this pact reaffirms the importance of fortress of Zion, Jerusalem, as the spiritual capital of Israel. God promises that his presence will be there forever, making the city a symbol of Israel's holiness, reverence, and tradition. This reveals the value of the physical location, but also the spiritual significance that transcends generations. This chapter reinforces that the biblical history of Israel is not just chronology or genealogy, but a living narrative of God's work in forming a holy people. It is an invitation to understand our own spiritual identity in light of God's promises, recognizing that he always fulfills what he promises. Therefore, the chosen people must remain steadfast in obedience and worship. David was not only a warrior and spiritual leader, he also knew how to organize the kingdom of Israel wisely. To do this, he strengthened alliances with the tribes, consolidating a unified army and an effective administrative system. This union of the tribes from Benjamin to Zebulun, from Naphtali to Gad, shows that the strength of the chosen people lies in cooperation and faithfulness to the God of Israel. That the chronicler highlights the pacts made to guarantee peace and internal security. These tribal alliances were not simple political agreements, but spiritual commitments based on obedience to God and the preservation of Israel's spiritual identity. David knew that success depended on unity and loyalty, pillars that strengthened his leadership and the strengthening of the kingdom. David's military organization is another highlight. The Israeli army was structured to be efficient and courageous, with dedicated leaders and warriors ready to defend the nation. This structure not only served for defense, but to expand Jerusalem's domain and influence, making it Fortress of Zion a symbol of divine power and protection. Furthermore, the feast in Hebron, which lasted 3 days, celebrated this unity between the tribes and reaffirmed David's legitimacy as king. It was a moment of joy and reaffirmation of the mission given by God, something that strengthens the tradition of Israel and the collective identity of the people. The events like these are living examples of how moments of celebration reinforce bonds and common goals. Finally, David kept God at the center of everything. The kingdom was not just a matter of strategy or power, but a spiritual mission. This divine centrality is what ensures the continuity of the kingdom, God's promises and David's firm and fair leadership, which would be remembered by the chronicler as an example for future generations. Bringing the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem was one of the most significant moments in David's leadership. This event symbolizes God's centrality to the chosen people, reaffirming the importance of authorship of God and of the obedience to his command. For David, the Ark represented the living presence of the God of Israel in the heart of the nation, and he wanted that presence to be felt tangibly by everyone. The celebration was exuberant, with musical instruments, dancing, and joy that spread throughout everyone. But the episode also teaches us about reverence and holiness. The Ark could not be transported in any way, such as on a cart, but only by the Levites, according to divine order. This reinforces the care and respect that the people should have for the ark, tradition of Israel, and by holiness and reverence. Goodbye, the chronicler, when narrating the celebration, not only describes a historical event, but invites us to reflect on the importance of always keeping God at the center. As a true king of Israel at Jerusalem, the fortress of Zion is not just a physical capital, but a symbol of the place where God dwells with his people. Furthermore, the return of the ark reinforces the people's commitment to messianic promises and with the spiritual identity that unites them. It is a powerful reminder that Israel's biblical history is deeply connected to the divine presence, and that the nation's success and protection depend on this sacred covenant. That finally, this narrative demonstrates how David, with his leadership, sought not only political power, but to consolidate a nation founded on faith and fidelity to God. Thus, he paves the way for a kingdom that transcends generations, establishing a spiritual legacy that echoes to this day. That now that you know a little more about the book of 1 Chronicles and the wealth of biblical history of Israel, the question remains, how can you apply the spiritual identity and faithfulness to God in your daily life? Have you truly placed God at the center of your life, as David did with his fortress of Zion? Think, what alliances have you cultivated? Are they like tribes united around divine purpose? Or are there areas of your life that still need to align with God's purpose, God's promises? How about starting today to strengthen this connection, seeking leadership and obedience that transform stories? If this content touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and follow our next reflections. Together, we will explore even more the treasures of Old Testament, the tradition of Israel, and everything that helps us live with holiness and reverence before our God. So, are you ready to leave the book of 1 Chronicles open doors of understanding and transformation in your life? Leave your comment, share the video, and come be part of this journey of faith and knowledge.